morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now the activity formally begin. Let's welcome Chairman of Taiwan Future Society, Kwang Shi-ye, to make a speech.
Good morning. Honorable Dr. Joy Ito, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored today to invite Dr. Ito to deliver a speech today on behalf of the sponsoring organizations, the Taiwan Future Society, 阳明山未来学社, the Fairwind Foundation, 长风基金会, Taiwan Women on Boards, 台湾女董事协会, the National Women's League, 中华民国妇女联合会, and the Outliers Fund. I would like to welcome you all to attend this event. Dr. Ito is a world-renowned entrepreneur, investor, and a technology facilitator. The topic that Dr. Ito is going to talk about is the impact of future technology on media. And the talk will focus on the intersection of two rapidly evolving technologies, Web3 and AI. I would like to express my spacious appreciation to Poseidon Ho, okay, of the Outliers Fund, who introduced Dr. Ito to the Taiwan Future Society and make this event possible. Poseidon will introduce Dr. Ito to you after my opening remark. As we all know, media is highly influenced by the advancement of technology. Communication theorist Marshall McLuhan has coined a famous phrase, "The medium is the message." Technology delivers message via media that will change our perception of the world and our social life. Currently, most of us still utilize Web 2 to do our works or leisure. Virtually all important social media platforms are controlled by large organizations and managed by centralized structures and systems. Web 3 will have a very different structure and will have a tremendous impact on media. Web 3 is an important message to us. Dr. Ito will address what message Web 3 delivers and how and why Web 3 and AI technology will make such an impact. These days, the hottest technology topic people are discussing is ChatGPT. So the following remarks are quoted from ChatGPT with only a few minor changes. I guess that you can see how powerful AI technology can impact our future life. Now the beginning of remarks written by ChatGPT, okay? Technology has always had a profound impact on the media landscape, shaping the way we consume and create content. From the printing press to the internet, each new advancement has brought both opportunities and technological innovation in recent years. We are now on the cusp of a new era that promises to transform the media landscape once again. Today, Dr. Ito, in the original word, not Dr. Ito, you say it. Okay, so Dr. Ito will explore the impact of future technology on media and examine how emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and blockchain are poised to shape the media industry in the years to come. As we delve deeper into the digital age, it is becoming increasingly important to understand how these technologies can work together to create new opportunities, possibilities, and ethical issues. Web 3, also known as the decentralized web, promises to evolutionize the way we interact with data, while AI is transforming the way we analyze and utilize that data. Together, these technologies have the potential to reshape industries and change the way we live our lives. Throughout this talk, Dr. Ito will explore the latest development and discuss the challenges and opportunities presented by the convergence of Web3 and AI. I hope this talk will be an exciting and informative experience for all of us. Dr. Ito will specifically address decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, and blockchains. DAOs have emerged as a promising new model for collective decision-making and resource allocation. DAOs operate using smart contracts on a blockchain, enabling members to vote and propose changes to the organization's rule and process transparently and democratically. That's the end of the remark made by ChatGPT. Okay, is it good? Okay, we will know how good my quote from ChatGPT is after Dr. Ito's talk, okay? Now let's welcome Poseidon to introduce Dr. Ito.
Today I'm just very nervous and very humble for the first time to invite my professor and director back in the MIT Media Lab to Taiwan. He just told me yesterday that the last time he came to Taiwan was 2007. And the last time before 2007 was before www, the internet was actually built. And speaking about this, I want to use a little story as an opener that can probably transition to the perfect topic of DAO that Joy will be sharing a lot about these days, which is 7 years ago when I was 21 years old at MIT, I was still a student. And I probably couldn't imagine 7 years later that I could be running one of the most promising VC fund in the Web3 space because of DAO. 7 years ago, when Joy was a director at MIT Media Lab, he really encouraged us to set up different special interest groups. So there is special interest group on space exploration, special interest group on deep ocean technology, and I set up one on special interest group on sci-fi inspired research. After I took a course called MIT Media Lab Science Fiction Prototyping course by Joe and Joy and other professors. And during that time, I realized that more than half of my time at MIT was not spent on research assistantships, was not spent on teaching assistantship, but kept finding a lot of students who have radical minds, solid hands, and unique stories into a Slack group. So every time when I go to this place with several hundred students in a social networking event, I will try to talk to everyone and then maybe select just one of the most radical mind that I found in this room to join the Slack. And after I collect 88 people in that Slack group, one day, one of my best friends reached out to me by saying that, hey, Poseidon, I want to give you 100K for you to invest in people, because I found out that most of my most interesting people, most interesting friends are coming out of the Slack group that you set up about special interest group on sci-fi inspired research. And after Yen put out the first 100K, it became another 20 students and professors wanted to do the same. So it became a syndicate among MIT students and professors. Back then, I was trying to avoid being taxed and falling into this IRS loophole. So I set up my Ether wallet for them to transfer slightly over 800,000 ETH into my Ether wallet. And I realized that probably the best investment decision I could make in the past few years would be just not touching those 800,000 ETH. That would have been awesome. But I'm glad that we did a lot of work on syndicating these. I would say today Joy's talk will largely be about Web3, DAO, NFT, and how it transformed many of our lives. I know that out there's a lot of people who is very skeptical about these. I'm also very skeptical on various of applications such as DeFi, GameFi, SocialFi. But I'm just gonna say that 7 years ago, when I was still a student at National Taiwan University, I have never met an undergrad student, master's student, PhD student, or even any professor who is actually doing venture investing or angel investing. At least I don't know. I guess it's because the infrastructure wasn't there. It's very hard to kickstart your own fund. For example, if me and Kwang and Jacqueline, if we were back in college as a roommate, as a lab mate, and we have a very sharp idea to invest in one certain technology direction, such as space exploration or satellites, the cost for us to set up a venture capital fund is usually at least 100K to 200K, at least 1 to 2 years, from setting up a fund structure, acquiring a fund license, set up a bank account, and get third-party custodian and auditing from Big Four before we can even fundraise. And we probably have to have the confidence to raise over 10 million, so that 2% of the management fee can cover the initial 200K setup cost. So that is the entry barrier. But several years later, when we have DAO, and especially, I wouldn't touch much into the topic that Joy will be sharing, but I'm just gonna share that right now, the cost for setting up a venture capital fund or a venture DAO is 0.001 Ethereum, which is in between 1 to 2 US$. And the time is about 5 to 10 minutes. It's totally legal compliant in the United States under the SEC regulation of investment club. There is 2 restrictions, that it needs to be under 150 million US$, it needs to be under 99 shareholders, but it allows you to be doing like what we are currently doing these days, invest in really a lot of different Web3 startups using off-chain equity investment, NFTs, or native tokens. And I would say, if without Joy, if without the era and rising of Web3 DAO NFT, we wouldn't be possible to see someone at my age to run a VC fund. But today, there's a lot of them out there. And I think I just want to use this little story to transition to Joy. So let's welcome Joy.
Thank you, Poseidon. I think many of you in the room here probably remember before internet, right? Where before we had email, and things were slower, right? Things were more predictable. If you did A and it happened B and then C would happen. In physics, we call this Newtonian. It's kind of like billiard balls. The world was slower, more predictable. And then the internet happened, and I think things changed more than just incrementally. So when the internet happened, there was an explosion of connectivity. There was high speed, high complexity, and things changed. And kids like Poseidon became digital natives. And we try to imagine that we can keep up, but it's a very different world right now. And I want to say that, and it's almost in physics, you have Newtonian physics, and then you have special relativity, Heisenberg, And I think that we have a very different reality now after internet. And some of us think that maybe we can keep up after internet, and I hope we can. But I think that the world has changed quite a bit. And the topic, I'm glad that the chairman talked about Marshall McLuhan at the beginning, because we talked about the word media, but I think we have to remember, I used to run the media lab, so I used to have to define media a lot. And media in English is the plural for medium, right? So when Marshall McLuhan says the medium is the message, Marshall's talking about the fact that more important than what's written in the message is the medium in which you write the message determines what you can say and determines the reality. And when the communications went from paper to digital, from slowly connected to hyper-connected, the medium changed. The medium changed from paper and structure and Newtonian physics to networks. And the network medium is very different. The network medium, when you're always connected, it's less about content and it's more about context, right? So context is who's connected to who when. It's about the fact that if you get an email telling you the price of your particular investment in Poseidon's fund, for the rest of the world, that information isn't very valuable. But for Poseidon, at that moment, it's super valuable. So context becomes the medium. And the news media changes. So social media is less about the content. It's about who's saying it when and what trajectory and how it's connected. And to think about the network as a medium is a very different way than thinking about content. It is like going from nouns to verbs, right? From things that don't move to things that are moving very quickly. And so it's a fundamental shift in the medium. So you can't look at media just like we used to think about media. It's not shifting from newspapers. I used to be on the board of the New York Times, and the New York Times would get angry at these kids and shake their fist. And they didn't realize that the point of these kids was not to tell the truth, it was to get the New York Times angry. So when the New York Times is angry, they're just feeding these trolls who run around and are enjoying it. And so they didn't realize also that the old media would write about the battlefield. But I told the New York Times, no, you're not writing about the battlefield. You are the battlefield. You know, that's where the battlefield has gone. And I think it's also important that in kind of relativity, so you often people in America say, you know, it's fighting the traffic. And, you know, one of our professors, Kevin Slavin, said, you're not stuck in traffic. You are traffic. You know, so the news media always says, well, we are never the news. No, they are the news, right? So I want to set up sort of this idea of media at the beginning and the medium, because I'm going to go deep dive into what the medium is that we're talking about and sort of the nature of the medium. But I will say another part about the definition of word media, the more traditional word, is the fourth estate. So before the French Revolution, you had the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, and then the fourth estate, the media, was supposed to be in charge of advocacy and the implicit ability to frame political issues. So governance and governing a democracy has to have media as a primary function. And I think all of these things are affected by Web3. So I'll say this is kind of my hypothesis for today, is that the combination of Web3 and AI will transform transparency, accountability, interpretability, and governance, which is really the domain of media. And the key thing here is that I think Web3 increases transparency and accountability, but transparency without interpretability and without governance doesn't help you so much. One of my mentors, Lawrence Lessig, has this great paper against transparency, which is transparency that's misinterpreted is almost worse because you get the wrong idea. If you see a politician's records, but it gives you the wrong idea about what the politician is doing, it could be negative. And so interpretability and understanding is really important, and that's why I think that the combination of AI and Web3 will deliver this, not just by itself. So a lot of the scams that we see in DAOs and tokens, it's all there on the chain, but we can't read it, we can't understand it, and I think that bringing AI into Web3 will help us understand it. But I want to zoom way back. So this is a Sumerian tablet from about 7,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian civilization. And this is the first ledger. In this clay tablet using cuneiform, they were able to keep a record, a ledger of what people brought to the cities and who owed who what, the milk, the wood, the rocks. And for the first time, cities grew beyond 10,000 people because they were able to coordinate massive activities within the city and keep track of ownership. But it was still centralized. This was kept by the high priests, and it just kept the relationship between the kingdom and the people who were interacting with it. And many types of accounting innovation happens, but another very important innovation happened about 600 to 700 years ago, which is double-entry bookkeeping. And just around this time, mathematicians who like gambling came up with many of the principles of statistics and probability. And with probability, you were able to do things like credit, insurance, and calculating interest. And with the double-entry bookkeeping, we were able to create corporations and more decentralized ownership and relationship between those entities. And modern capitalism, I think, with the Medici traders, was able to grow from here. So you had centralized accounting with clay tablets, and then you have paper and ink, and we're able to create corporations and capitalism. One thing to observe is that we haven't seen much innovation since then. Like we use computers to manage our companies, but when we file our taxes, when we issue our annual report, we issue it on paper, mostly, that has to be reduced to ink. Your balance sheet and P&L are just basic derivatives of double-entry bookkeeping. And if, Poseidon and I give you a note that says, I will give you $1 million if it rains tomorrow, and if the consensus of the room is roughly 50%, if you had to close your books, you'd have to write down $500,000, even though it will never be $500,000. It's either 0 or $1 million with a rough 50% probability. So you have a probabilistic entry So in your ERP system or your contract, you may have that. But when you reduce it to accounting, it becomes a static number, which is the wrong number, and it has lost all the information, all of the probabilistic models. So this is, keep using the word probabilistic. And what we're thinking about now, I think, with the blockchain, is for the first time, maybe in 600 or 700 years, we're changing the medium of accounting from paper to digital. So we're already using digital in ERP systems. We're already using digital in finance. But the accounting is not yet really necessarily digital. And this digital transformation is essential. And as I won't go into what a blockchain is, I assume everyone knows, but a key feature of the blockchain is that it's like a ledger, except everyone can access it. It's not owned by any company or any corporation. And anyone can write to it if they pay the gas. So it's a permissionless, publicly available, immutable ledger, which is extremely important. And then after Bitcoin, what happened with Ethereum is you now have smart contracts. So not only are we recording who owes who what, we can put a contract in there. And this contract is really important. So you have to understand that that promises. So if a traditional contract, and we have Jacqueline, lawyer, judge, so if I have a contract, the only way you enforce a contract is if you have policemen and judges and lawyers and people who check the stamps and the IDs. But with this smart contract, it's in the blockchain, everyone can read it, and just like a vending machine, I know that if I put $100 in here, that I'm going to get the key. And there's no case where I give the money, I don't get the key, or I give the key, I don't get the money. All of the stuff that the banks, the credit card companies, the lawyers, the judges do, that's all held by the blockchain. And these contracts that are automatically executed on-chain, and the relationships between the people, and all of the promises can be executed on-chain. Now, there are bugs, there are lots of problems with this, but what happens when we go from just the accounting system of the double entry bookkeeping to be able to put all of our assets, all of our promises, all of our relationships onto the chain completely changes what we can do with the accounting layer. And like the ledger, like double entry bookkeeping, in the long run, this has a substantial transformation of what we can do. And I'll start to put a little bit of AI in here, because once you start to build a probabilistic model, so this is some math that we're doing with the probabilistic computing project at MIT, and you could take a company, the whole company, and create a model of the company, and then you could calculate and you could come up with a definition of what the revenue multiplier is. And you can even create, the bottom half is, you take all of the different public companies, and then you can generate things like synthetic companies. But what used to be that you can only add and subtract single numbers, you can now add and subtract and do things against very complex probabilistic models, and this can also be written to the blockchain. And this isn't reduced. So this can take all of the accounts of a company and treat it like an entry in a book. So these are the two things that I think are going to transform what we can do. And to describe a little bit of what accounting is. So Ethereum, in their annual report, they don't say we're a cryptocurrency. They say we are a protocol for human coordination, which is very similar to what accounting was. The ledger, double entry bookkeeping, this is human society trying to do something more, to create corporations, to have trades, to have commerce, and accounting unlocks that layer. Now, blockchain will unlock a whole different level of the kinds of things we can coordinate. And so the way I think about it is, and this is, I think, an easier way to think about blockchain, is it is programmable business. It's programmable government. It's programmable society. It's the ability to do some things by hand, but many things can program, so we can have more complexity, we can have more nuance, we can have more scale. It's not always good, right? Just because the Industrial Revolution may have made good things, but it also made very bad things, making things programmable will make things more powerful and efficient and effective, but unless we manage it correctly, it doesn't necessarily make it better. So I just want to say that while I'm excited about the technology, we have to do our job very well to make sure that society gets better and not worse. So let's talk a little bit about Web3. So I think it's just a word. The web has come in waves. And the first wave was, I think, email getting internet to everybody. And Web3 with blockchain is unlocking this layer of value and promises. And the first wave of internet disrupted telecommunications. And the second wave of internet disrupted the media companies. And the third wave is, I think, disrupting governments and banks and securities firms. And the way I think about technology is that as technology has increased, the cost of communication and collaboration has gone down. And so that's to Poseidon's point, that the cost of setting up a company or a DAO went from nearly impossible to nearly free. And the complexity increases as well. But the other thing that happens is it goes back and forth between centralized and decentralized. So before we had corporations, everything was decentralized, bizarre. And then you had corporations and it became centralized. And then Web 1 pushed for decentralization so that there weren't centralized servers, but then it became centralized again. Web 2 tried to decentralize. The early blogs were actually quite decentralized, but then Facebook centralized it again. So I think we need to take the best parts of decentralization, but I think as governments and regulators get involved, we'll see some other things become centralized. And why Web3? I won't go into this too far, but I think it's really important that it's public. So, I was talking to Audrey Tang earlier today, and the fact that the blockchain is in public means that standards and protocols can also be decentralized. And so Taiwan can have relationships with countries without formal track one. We can have a credentialing system where everybody is participating, but no one can stop other people from participating. And I think it's really important as we start to think about technical protocols and legal protocols. In the past, somebody had power. Somebody was the chairman of the organization, and they would decide who the board members were, and it was still a permission-based system, even though it was kind of a community. But now with the public system, there's a competition of ideas and a competition of protocols, and it's quite democratic in the way things are decided. It still has some problems because, as we'll talk about, democracy isn't always fair, it's not always efficient, but it's still, I think, a much better model than the centralized system. It's extremely transparent, but as we said earlier, the transparency by itself isn't enough. We need interpretability. The programmatic part we talked about, and we'll talk about DAOs, which is the organizational structure that you get when you have all of these three things. So what is a DAO? A DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. And the first DAOs, the first DAO ever was a programmatic fund that allowed people to pay into the fund, and then they would vote, and the program would pay out and invest. But the first DAO was a big failure because there was a bug and somebody stole a bunch of money and it caused a terrible accident. And recently, though, the DAOs aren't fully automated. So they use the term decentralized autonomous organization, but most DAOs are, in fact, communities of people that use some of the tools of automation to try to more effectively, transparently, and in a decentralized way manage these organizations. So let's talk a little bit about DAOs. So on the very left, we have, let's see if this works. Is this a, no, it's not. So the very left, with the double entry bookkeeping, we had corporations where you had investors and you had management, and they controlled and they owned the company. And with venture capital, what happened was we had stock options. So stock options allowed people who weren't investors to participate in the upside through stock options, so that venture capitalists were able to get very talented employees from large companies to take the risk of joining a startup because they also participated in the upside. What's happening with DAOs, which is quite interesting, is that they are now dropping in their airdrops tokens to customers. So customers are also now part of the upside. The other thing is, unlike corporations where you can continue to issue more stock whenever you want, diluting people, most tokens, it's a set amount or it's a programmatic amount. So the left side, the treasury, is the tokens that the DAO controls for issuing. It's a technicality, but the main difference is that it looks a little bit more like managing a central banking economy and a little bit less like a contractual relationship with in a shareholding company. But the fact that the customer is now a participant, often holding more shares, more tokens than the management, is a pretty different structure. In a good day, the customers get to have their say, they get rewarded for helping the company. On a bad day, it's also an easy way to make a scam. You can say to the customer, use my product and you'll make some money. and then you can take their money and run away. And so one of the key things with this structure is it can be very good because it involves the customer, but it can be very bad because it can get the customer to expect some upside when they don't have it. And this is the kind of governance challenge that we have, but I think there's quite a bit of opportunity to see where the DAOs go. But the key thing for DAOs is going to be transparency and governance. When you bring the customers and many, many stakeholders into a DAO, how does the governance work? And I mentioned Larry Lessig earlier, but he had a wonderful framework for thinking about management or control. And he says it's not just DAOs, but just anything. You can regulate people's behavior and activity through laws, through culture, through business and technology. So let's say, and again, Jacqueline's a judge, so she'll I think, appreciate this. If you have a street and people are speeding on the street, if you build speed bumps, that's a technical intervention. If you increase the fine, that's a business intervention. If you have legal punishment and more police, that's a legal system. And if you make the neighborhood shame the person for speeding too fast, that's a cultural intervention. And depending on the thing you're trying to do, picking the quadrant that's the most effective, and often it's all of them, is key. And as we talked to regulators yesterday, I think a really important piece is if you can fix it with technology, it's usually cheaper and more effective than it is to fix it with other things. So it's better to make something technically impossible rather than just making it illegal or shameful. And so as we start to see DAOs and exchanges, I think it's very important to try to see how the technology can support the governance and that we don't just rely on laws and norms. But the problem is, in many societies, especially in places like Japan, everything is very vertical. So the lawyers don't talk to the technologists. And I think yesterday what was really great was that there were technologists and business people and lawyers and media in the room. And I think that multifaceted approach is important. And for DAOs, I think we have to think about it in the same way. So I want to give you an example. So I have a podcast in Japan. And what I did was I started interacting with my listeners by creating a Discord channel. And a Discord channel has a lot of chats, and we have about 1,000 members, and we have a lot of projects. And this is the Discord channel where we're talking with each other, and it's 1,000 members, but I'd say a couple hundred active. And as part of this project, it's a community that does all kinds of things. We have discussions about autism, we have tea ceremony, and there are many sub-communities that do many things. And in here, we have a lot of volunteers. And so what we did was we issued a token, an ERC20 token, which people give to each other when they help each other. But because of the regulation in Japan, and also because I wanted to do an experiment, we made a rule that you can't buy the token and you can't sell the token, but we can exchange the token amongst ourselves. And this is D-Work, which is a startup company that I guess we're both invested in. And what you do is the community decides things that need to get done on the left. And if you want to volunteer, you pick it up and you put your name on it. And then once it's done, the community checks to see if it was done. And then once it's checked that if it's done, an administrator can click pay, and the person gets these henkaku tokens into their wallet. Roughly the exchange rate is 1 hour is about 100 henkaku, right? So as you start to help the community, you accumulate these henkaku tokens. A key thing, if you think about this, is that normally if you have an organization with 1,000 people doing volunteer work, there's somebody has to keep track and give everybody the thing, and then you go to the bank account and you send it in. This is completely decentralized. There's no one has to spend any time running this day to day. We have a team that kind of edits it, but it's all community oriented, and we're able to keep track of people's volunteer work and the payout. And what's interesting is then you have those tokens. If you have tokens, you can vote. So we use Snapshot, which is a voting mechanism. So that when we have a discussion, the discussion turns into a page, and the page turns into a proposal, and everybody who has tokens can vote. And then once you have a lot of tokens, you can buy NFTs. And some of the NFTs have different functions. One of my favorite ones is the invitation NFT. So if Poseidon wants to join the community, he can't pay to get in. He can't buy this NFT. Somebody has to pay 1,000 henkaku and send him the invitation NFT. So 1,000 henkaku is 10 hours of work. So if Jacqueline wants to invite Poseidon, she has to volunteer 10 hours of work, accumulate the tokens, buy this NFT, and send it to Poseidon. And many communities have all kinds of fancy membership systems. I'm sure your club has a membership system where there's a nominating committee and there are referrals, and did the referred, have they spent enough time? Well, let's check the person. And with 1,000 members, we've never had a problem, because for somebody to invite somebody, they have to put in 10 hours of work, which is a lot of work. And then they spend it and they have to put in 10 hours to bid somebody else. And you can see on the blockchain who invited who. And they feel responsible for that person. So by creating one smart contract in an NFT, we were able to automate something that's usually quite difficult and painful to do. And we're able to do it in a way without, also a key thing is none of this involves money, right? So I think a lot of Web3 is focused on money. But if you think about going back to the phrase, coordinating system for human activity, right? So if you have a house, and you have 10 people, and your family, if one person's not doing the dishes, you know, you feel bad about. They need to do the dishes. So obviously pure love, yes, your family, you all love each other, but even in a family, you keep track of who's doing dishes, who's not doing dishes, my family at least. And you don't pay money, you don't pay your son, or maybe some families do, but usually you don't pay your son to do the dishes, but you expect them to do the dishes. If it's 10 people, you can keep track. If it's 100 people, it's difficult to keep track. And how do you know if Dom was doing the dishes while I was sleeping? And to create a sense of fairness, you actually tracking those kinds of things could be important. And in our communities, Henkaku token isn't money, but it's a kind of fairness, and you can see everyone's numbers. For example, this is our Dune Analytics. So this is our token, we can see the wallets, you can see who's doing what, and we can analyze all of this stuff. And I think what's important, and this is something for me is kind of a TBD, but in Japan, we're trying to deploy Web3, but we're focusing more on nonprofits, I am. So on school research communities, on PTAs, on local governments, on volunteer communities, and we're trying to see if we can take the tools that were created by the crypto investors to scale investments to do things like manage nonprofits. And if you think about also, so Poseidon was talking about MIT. So if I was in the business side of MIT and the academic side of MIT, I'll tell you the people who act the most important are the professors. Because a PhD or a degree, you can't buy it with money. The only place you can get it is from the professors, right? And it's a currency, it's a token, but you can't buy it with money and you can't convert it to money, but it's more important than the money that you spend. If you could buy the PhD, the value of the PhD would go down, right? And so I think also, you know, if you look at winemakers, the person who's making the wine is usually more important than the business person that's supporting that person who's making the wine. And that wine can convert to money. You sell the wine, it's quite expensive, but the winemaker themselves is not focused on money. They're focused on the grape. You know, if you go to a church, the priest is less focused on the money, or should be less focused on the money, and more focused on God, right? And but each of these enterprises, the church, the winemaker, the school, there's a robust business around it, but the key value inside is not money. It's something that's beyond money, and that has not scaled very well. Universities are hundreds of years old, and it's an important system, but my question is, can we make more inclusive, more interesting, more decentralized communities of things other than just money using some of these tools? And this is some of the experimentation that I'm working on, but I think that has a closer affinity to things like media. Yesterday, Jacqueline introduced me to her friend who's running a big media company, and we were talking about this. How do you motivate the journalists? The journalists aren't in it for the money. How do we transform a paper-based journalism system into a fourth estate contributor to the world? You have to motivate the people, you have to collect the best people, and it has to be partly about the money because you have to be able to feed yourself, but the high bar, after you pay your tuition to get your PhD, that goes way beyond the money, and how can we use some of these tools for that? That, I think, is an important question. One of the things we need to do is actually fix the governance. And a couple of the things where technology is now rolling out in DAOs, because we can see that because it's on the blockchain, because it's digital, we can do more native tools. One is simple voting is actually quite bad. It has some tyranny of the majority, it has a lot of unfairness, it's broken in many ways, so voting can be improved. The other thing is that conversation is quite one way right now. And if you're in a chat room, everyone's talking at the same time. There's very little way for 10,000 people to have a conversation. It's difficult, and it's kind of a mess. And then the other thing is we have all this transparency and all this information. How can we interpret and analyze it? So these are some of the tools that we're working on. Quadratic voting is just one test. And again, I heard from Audrey that they're doing quadratic funding. So it's probably a known word in Taiwan. But the idea with quadratic voting is if you have multiple preferences, if somebody likes A over B and somebody likes B over C and somebody likes C over A, it turns out that there's a problem where you do a normal vote and those preferences don't get recorded. So by quadratic voting, you get a budget, and instead of just doing linear preferences, by voting in the order of who you like with however much you want to do, you're able to take into consideration the preference order as well as how much and the power of the direction. And the reason it's called quadratic is that mathematically it turns out that if you value the square root of the number of votes you put into a thing, it's able to take the preferences without allowing people to overwhelm the votes in one way. And I'm happy to send you some of the papers on this, but this is a very interesting new innovation that blogs and Web3 people are excited about, but we're seeing, like in Taiwan, governments now picking up some of those new ways of doing voting to do fairer and more interesting voting. So this is one of the areas I think that research in Web3 is going to impact democracy. This is another tool by one of our collaborators, and what this is AI-facilitated discussion. The left is called Unicask. It's a whiskey DAO, and what they're doing is they have all these conversations in their Discord channel. But what the AI does is then it takes all of the conversation and maps it into a network of ideas, and then it allows people to then reinforce the preferences, and then at the end you come back with what are the key things that the people care about, and it turns out they're caring about the quality of the whiskey, bottle design, and labeling and graphics. But what it's able to do is take thousands of people talking at the same time and try to sort out what their preferences are, what the ideas are, what the outliers are, and to be able to have the conversation happen in parallel and very quickly come to some kind of consensus. And again, this isn't perfect, but with things like machine learning tools, I think we'll be able to facilitate conversation much better. And then lastly, I think AI is a very important area. And AI, again, just as somebody from MIT, you know, AI is usually everything they call the stuff you can't do yet. And anything you can do, they give it a name, you know, and it becomes boring. And even ChatGPT, I don't know if you've noticed this, but at the beginning when you're using it, it's like magic. But once you start using it every day, you're like, why is it messing up again? And it just becomes a tool, right? And I think it's important to remember that AI, all of these things will just become functions pretty soon. But I think the AI does make us more powerful, both good and for bad. So Norbert Wiener in 1964 had a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and he predicted many of the issues we have now. But he has a wonderful and important phrase, which he said that bureaucracies and companies are machines of flesh and blood. And this is very important because if you think of a company, right, with it has a board of directors and has all these rules and functions, even the government, it's actually a machine. It doesn't have a spirit. It doesn't have a responsibility, and humans are no longer in control. Many companies are not in control anymore. They're just autonomous processes that run around and can destroy environments, can go, hurt people. And so we've been already struggling. We say, someday machines may become autonomous. No, ever since we had corporations and governments, we already have autonomous machines. They're just, people are the cogs. People aren't in charge. So many of the governance challenges, again, as a judge that you have with regulating financial institutions is very similar to the issue we're going to have with AIs. They are already a kind of AI. The main difference with the new machine learning tools, with blockchain, all of these things, it just becomes more powerful. So it's like you're putting jetpacks on everybody and then you blast off. So if you're pointed in the wrong direction, you go wrong direction very fast. And if you're pointed in the right direction, we'll go in the right direction very fast. But I think what's important, more important than making the system more efficient, is to make sure we can head in the right direction and fix our course as we go. And I think the problem right now is that we're not doing that. This is an older study. I think this was 2018 news. But Amazon trained an AI on their HR data. And the AI came out saying, oh, well, let's just hire men. And it turns out that at Amazon, women just weren't promoted as much, and they didn't do as well. And the problem with AI, as just a vanilla AI, statistical AI, is it looks at past history and makes a model. So you're not ever progressive. You're basically saying, okay, women historically did not do well in Amazon, so let's not hire women, is kind of the outcome. And it's very difficult to change the direction of the past if you're only predicting the future based on the past. That's kind of obvious. And that's kind of built into AI. There are ways to try to remove bias and change the trajectory, but it's not easy because then somebody has to change it. And who changes it? And who's accountable for them? So even if we make AI, actually even more if we make AI, the governance of AI is going to become very important. This is a wonderful paper, or blog post, I guess, where somebody took ChatGPT and made them answer quizzes that told you about politics. So this looks like that ChatGPT is left-wing and slightly libertarian, right? But now people are giving feedback and they're saying, oh, but it shouldn't be. It should be in the middle, or it should be up and to the left. And other people are saying maybe it should give right-wing answers to right-wing and left-wing answers to left-wing. Or maybe it should be the opposite. But the fact that you can now start tuning the political view of an AI, who decides and how do we decide? And how does this influence what we believe? This is a very important governance challenge, and it has some technical components to it. But I think it has some very important fundamental issues. So even in the US, affirmative action is no longer legal. Right? You can't put your thumb on the scale because it's considered unfair. It's considered discrimination even to discriminate in a pro-social way. And so some of the laws around dealing with bias also, I think, need to be addressed. So I think many of us now make fun of ChatGPT because it gets so many things wrong, right? And let me just describe a little bit a key thing about large language models, which what we're seeing now. Large language models are deep neural networks. So they're large entangled vectors, and what you do is you take massive data sets and you train the model, and it's kind of like autocomplete, right? So it's trying to guess what the answer is based on a whole bunch of information that it knows, but it's unable to explain to you how it got the answer, and it doesn't know when it's wrong, because it's just kind of guessing the answer based on a very tangled system of offline data. Now, this is super useful, like the earlier description, but it's very dangerous when you're asking for a drug recommendation for a medical disease, or if you're trying to make very important decisions. And what we're working on, this is a project that I've been involved with at MIT for about 6 years now, is probabilistic programming. And probabilistic programming is symbolic. So neural nets are neural, and symbolic is symbolic. So symbolic systems are structured. So neural nets don't know rules or structure. It learns patterns, and it sounds like it knows structure because it's repeating things that talk about structure, but it doesn't actually understand mathematics or gravity or law, whereas probabilistic computing is focused on structure, and it's also is Bayesian, so it learns in real time, and you don't do it offline with data sets. And the combination of these two, so we're calling it neuro-symbolic programming, is I think going to be quite interesting, and this will tie back to DAOs. So one of the demos that we've now set up, so one of the uses of OpenAI, or of GPT, there's a tool called OpenAI Codec, or GPT Codec, and what that does is it takes natural language and can output computer code. So right now you have to be a programmer to program computers. Now with GPT, you can talk in natural language and produce computer code. And what we have right now is with this probabilistic programming, you can take large data sets. So again, OpenAI, not OpenAI, GPT uses language, so textbooks, spoken language, and converts it into models. Probabilistic programs take databases and structure and converts it into models. And so what we want to do is we want to take natural language as input, and then convert natural language to probabilistic inferences. This is, sorry, this is a little bit technical, but so you don't have to learn how to write this, and then produce output. So this is an example that one of MIT researchers has put together. So you can ask natural language questions. This is the Stack Overflow developer survey. And what it does is you can ask these questions, it produces inference QL language, and it provides output. And this is, again, a very early demo using a fairly limited data set. But what I want you to imagine is whether it's a DAO or let's say you're talking about politics, you say, what is the item in the national budget this year that is the most unusual given previous years? And it will say this one. And then it says, okay, who are the politicians that were most involved in this budget item? These politicians. Given their past voting, what are the 3 issues that they're most interested in? And how do they affect my preferences, which are outlined by my browser habits? Well, these things. And you should be able to interact with data in natural language. You should be able to come into a company and say, which division of my company has the worst gender pay gap? Where are the managers in that group from? And you should be able to ask those questions against structured data in real time and get answers like this. And the technology now with natural language from GPT and structured language from probabilistic programming should make this accessible. And you can see very quickly how this affects how DAOs are. So right now you're looking at a token on an exchange. You don't know what it's behind it, but you should be able to say, so I think, if we call fair DAOs as, so what is the voting distribution of these DAOs? How much percentage of the DAO control do the founders have? Does the business model part of this DAO actually make money, or are they primarily making money on the increase in value of their tokens? These are natural language questions that you should be able to ask any exchange. And the data is all there. We should be able to see it. So this kind of inference question against data is the interpretability part that should be on the back of transparency. And using GPT and these structured models, your preference should be very available. They're already available to Amazon. So they should be available to us. So you should be able to say, given my preferences, does any of the money in my pension system support invested in companies that are against my preferences? Take it out. If my money is in any company and they're voting at the shareholders meeting against labor or against any of my preferences, vote the other way. You should be able to express your preferences and govern where your money goes based on your preferences. And in the long run, I think this should happen in government as well. And the other thing with blockchain and smart contracts is we're going to be able to start to separate the flows of money and the transparency and the governance. And a lot of public-private partnerships are difficult because the control and the transparency has to be done by hand. But I think public and private partnerships will become easier if you can mechanically control the flows. So I think that this is actually a really important area. And so towards the end, though, I'm going to pivot a little bit more and move away from technology. So the world is a self-adaptive complex system. The world is able roughly to stay the same temperature because you have all these interlocking complex systems, and there's no one in charge of the world. There's no one really in charge of your body, but we're able to maintain our body temperature, this equilibrium, because of these interlocking systems. And this is a basic system. So you have a state, so let's say the temperature, and you can measure the state, and you have a goal, and then you can affect the inflow and the outflow. So example is a bath. So if you want to take a bath, you want it to be a certain level of water. So you turn on the faucet, you plug the hole, and you try to get it to the same level. And then you say, okay, but I want it the perfect temperature. So you spin one knob, you can spin another knob, so you have like stocks, flows, but maybe your boiler is really far away. So it takes a little while for the hot water to come in. And then on the other side of the hot water, you have the city, and you have the electricity, and your bath is connected to many, many systems that are connected to many, many systems. And it's a very, very complex system that you can't control, but you can turn knobs and levers and things like that. But that's part of our whole society. And so our society is just a system of systems where you have control of little pieces, and each individual that's turning on the bath affects the environment, and the environment affects us. So this is what a system is. And there was a systems researcher at MIT, and her name was Donella Meadows. So she passed away, but she had this wonderful idea of, like, if you have a complex system, like the Taiwanese regulatory system of finance, there are levers and places to intervene. So whether it's a bathtub or it's the financial system. And so you can change the constant and the parameters, like taxation and subsidies. You can change the size of the buffers, the structure of the flows, the length of the delays, the strength, and these are all the different places you can intervene in a complex system. And then towards the bottom, you have like the rules of the system, and then you can have the goals of the system, and then you have the paradigms of the system and the power to transcend the paradigms. This is quite interesting and important. So the idea is that you can sit around and change the rules, but the rules are usually determined by the goals, right? And the goals are determined by the paradigm. So for instance, if we measure everything in money, it's very easy to end up with the goal, well, I should have more money. That's my goal, right? And if your goal is to have more money, you're going to try to get rules that help you have more money, right? And so we can say, you know, the modern capitalism has destroyed the environment and sustainability, and we can create carbon tokens and carbon taxation to try to change the rules to help the economy or the environment. But if your goal is to have more stuff than everyone else, changing the rules doesn't affect the behavior of the system as much as changing the goals. Changing the paradigm, which is I measure my value financially, that has more impact on the goal. And then how do you change that? Like, how do you change people so they don't want more stuff, that they care about other people, that they care about the environment? And that's the power to transcend paradigms. And that's where culture and education and other sorts of things live. So I do think that the rules are important, and I spend all of my time at sort of like layer 6, layer 8, but I want to make sure that we don't forget that many of these things are weaker than the goals. And the goals are weaker than the mindset, and the mindset is weaker than the paradigm to transform. And this paradigm to transform is things like democracy and media. It's the medium. It's can we say what we want in a civilized way? Can we respect each other? And can the young people have new values about, like in Japan now, Gen Z people don't want property. My generation, everybody wanted property. That was the goal, was to own a house. And that's not the goal for young people anymore, but we have to make room for that culture, because that culture is going to save the environment more, I think, than just some kind of SDG badge or carbon tax. And so I think that's really important. And so that's kind of where I want to end this. So I think you know the game Monopoly, right? And this is going to amplify my point. So it's based, actually, on a 1903 game called the Landlord's Game. And this was created to teach children the risk to society of landlords and tenants, that people will go bankrupt, you'll get income disparity. This was actually an early predecessor to communism. It was the Georgists. And what Milton Bradley did was they commercialized the game, but they just changed the goal. Instead of the goal being to teach children the perils of capitalism, the goal became, you're the capitalist and you win if you drive your friends bankrupt. You know? And to me, this is also important to realize that they didn't change the rules. They just changed the goal. And so in many ways, I think changing the goal maybe is more important. I mean, it's harder, right? I understand it's harder. You can't tell your children change your goals. But you can create an environment where it's more likely that they change their goals, or maybe give them permission if their goals have changed. And I think that's, again, rules are important, but I think this is an illustration of why that's important as well. And then this is a wonderful image that Stuart Brand, who created the Whole Earth Catalog, had. And this is called pace layering. And what he says is that you have different layers in society, kind of like you have different layers in a house. You have like the property, the foundations, the building, the interior, the people, the content. So nature moves the most slowly, and it's the foundation. And then on top of that, you have culture and governance and infrastructure and commerce and fashion. And in society, we like these upper levels because they're flashier. Fashion is fun, commerce is fun. But what we're doing is we're destroying nature because we're not paying attention to nature, at the expense of all of our attention at the higher levels. And it's important because when you change culture, you change the upper levels as well. So I think that a lot of the sustainability discussion is about let's focus on nature, but I think culture is a really important missing piece. And again, it's very difficult to do. It's easy to say, so I want to make sure that I'm not saying, oh yeah, we just only have to do that. But I think it's an underestimated part that is actually part of the whole system's thinking. And so, you know, I'll end here, and this is sort of passing it back to Poseidon, which is, you know, it's hard to understand these kids running around on Web3, doing these new things. And when I was at MIT, I would say that, you know, Poseidon was quite challenging for me, because here's this energetic kid breaking all the rules, and I was like his regulator, you know, say, you can't do that, stop. You know, but they're really the future. And I think what's important is that we have to give them the space to actually change their culture and because I think if you're always pushing against the establishment, which we have to do, but they are going to soon be the leaders that are taking us to the next phase. And I think that this cultural shift that's happening in the good parts of Web3, so again, if you look at the nasty parts of Web3, they're nasty. I mean, the blockchain attracts people who only want to make money. It attracts criminals. It attracts all these problems. But when you see the core people, the entrepreneurs, or if you go to the Ethereum Foundation and listen to Vitalik or Miyaguchi, I mean, she's talking about the future. She's talking about sharing, about society. And the really young kids who are at the core of this culture are forward, are thinking about the future, and I think we have an ability to start changing the system at all of the layers, including this cultural layer. And so I just wanted to today, although we were supposed to talk about media, kind of pull back and talk about governance, talk about systems, and getting back to that quadrant with Lessig's quadrants, the technology is important. So you have to understand culture, law, technology, and business all at the same time to be able to turn this wheel. And I think the young kids naturally understand this, and I think as sort of the supporting generation that we are, kind of pushing them in the right direction. But I think we can't but yield some of our control to the next generation in order for us to make it through this period. Thank you.
Now it's the QA section, and we receive any question from the stage.
Well, just one comment and then one question. I think your name, Ms. Dr. Ito Joy, should be spelled as J-O-Y in the future. Because I always think that AI should be aimed to bring the joy and happiness to the mankind. This is what I always believe, okay? And my question is kind of a macro. And maybe most of the people here in this room are most concerned. What is the situation of the AI in China? Because I was told by a professor in Tsinghua University, and he told me that the patents related to AI in the world in China tops all the nations in the world. And there's a recent debate in China. It's called China has nothing to do with Web3. And there's a pro and cons. And this is what I'm most concerned. Would you give me a feedback on that? Thank you.
So I'm not an expert, and I'm not in China, so I can only give you my observation. And I'll cite somebody else. So I was actually in Silicon Valley the other day with a friend who's married to Chinese and goes to China quite a bit. And he was interestingly criticizing the Americans. And his view was that the Chinese, because they have a lot of engineers that have a lot of influence, that the way that he said, again, this is third party, so I don't understand it deeply, but it made sense in an interesting way. He said that the Chinese that are in power are arguing that it's evidence-based democracy, evidence-based social policy, and that through surveillance and AI, they can optimize society. And many of the young Chinese that I talk to say, yeah, in fact, now with AI and the surveillance, there is less bad behavior. People don't throw their gum on the street, they wait for the lights, and there's some very practical positive outcomes from the data-oriented, evidence-based rulemaking. So that was kind of, and this American, which was interesting, said the Americans are behind. He said that we are eventually going to end up in a complete surveillance state anyway, and the Americans are going to keep fighting it, so they'll figure it out more slowly, whereas in China, they are having complete surveillance in AI for better or for worse, and society can respond and adapt to our AI future, and so they're going to figure it out before we do. This is this American saying it. I have a slightly different point of view. So Americans are also using AI for things like automated decision-making with judges and trying to optimize society. And a lot of the research that I did, so I taught a class on AI and ethics at Harvard and MIT together. And what we realized, and we did some studies that changed American law, but you can't, if you take the human out of the loop and you so there's a great paper about how you can't optimize ethics. So like when you get up in the morning and you say, okay, what's more important, young people or old people, privacy or security? You know, every person every day has a different priority of what is good. You know, and there's different philosophies for what is good. And machines are very good at optimizing. So if you tell the machine, here's the game, here are the rules, win the game, they can win the game. But you can't ask a machine, what's more important, my mother or my father, right? Because that, you can't optimize that. And all of the higher level, if we get back to this paradigms and the goals have to be set by our preferences. Our preferences are set by how we feel. And that's not an optimization. And so my concern about the idea of more efficient, data-driven society is that it works well if you know what you're trying to do, if you know what you're trying to optimize for. But the big question is, what should we be optimizing for? That has to be decided by the population, by democracy, by our people. Otherwise, you end up with a machine that's can't be, it's like a jetpack where you have your blindfolds on. You can't control where you're going. And so my fear is that with a data-driven society, you end up with the lack of ability to control. So if you happen to be pointed in the right direction, it's great. But if you're pointed in the wrong direction, you can't stop yourself. And my fear is that some of the ways in which I see AI being developed, or I hear that AI being developed is both in the US and in China is that risk. And I think that the approach that some of the Chinese comments that I hear is that they have an over-reliance on the AI and the machines. I will say for this probabilistic computing program that I shared, it comes out of the research in brain and cognitive science, which is more about trying to build a model or a theory of mind of the other person. So traditional AI is about optimization. It's sort of saying, here's the data, predict the best output. But theory of mind is basically saying, okay, I have a model of what Poseidon is trying to do. I see his behavior. I update the model, and I try to guess what Poseidon's goal is, and I try to guess what his capability is, and I try to guess what he knows. And then I constantly try to update this probabilistic model of Poseidon. So then my job is to figure out what Poseidon wants and to try to help Poseidon. And I think that kind of AI makes a better teacher and actually makes a better human-oriented community. So in the early days of AI, there was a split. Some people said it's artificial intelligence, and some people said it's intelligence augmentation, so IA. And I think that the intelligence augmentation is a smaller field because you don't make as much money doing it, so it hasn't been invested in as much. But I think intelligence augmentation is going to be a key piece. So I took this conversation a little bit away from China because I don't know the facts, but what I hear is that they're focused more on the optimization part than the human augmentation part. And I think that in the democratic societies where you're forced to involve human augmentation, that we hope to see AIs be designed. But I'll make one last comment here, which is important, is that traditionally, though, AI has cost money to train. So big companies and governments had money. And if you have an AI that does predictions, if you think about it, what it does, it takes, if I'm Google and I'm trying to predict Poseidon's behavior and nudge him to do something, I'm taking power from him to me, right? So traditional AI is about taking power from the predictee to the predictor. Because if you learn somebody's algorithm, you take their power. But what we were working on at MIT and continue to work on is you can turn the camera the other way. So what we did with this risk scores that Americans were using in judging, we were able to show that the system wasn't fair, that it was predicting unfairly. You know, we had a researcher at MIT that worked with me who we analyzed the conversations between doctors and patients. I'm sorry, I'm going to go into a detail, but I think it's useful. So there's angina, which is like heart pain. And until a few years ago, the world believed there were two diseases, typical angina and atypical angina. And women got atypical angina and men had typical angina. And more women were suffering from heart disease than men, but more men were getting interventions because the diagnostic system was biased against women. Once we did the analysis of the actual angiograms and the conversations, we were able to show that it's only one disease. Men and women have the same disease, they just express it differently. But traditionally AI, what it does is it tries to make diagnostic more efficient, but it never questions, is the assumption right? Is the system fair? So almost all AI points down, from power to powerless. But what we're trying to do by democratizing AI is to point it up. But it doesn't get funded. It's hard to get funded to change the assumptions of the medical establishment. It's easier to get funded to make the doctor more efficient. And so one of the key things as we're doing probabilistic computing and other things is a lot of the AI that's been invested in is very expensive AI. But ProbComp and others is quite cheap. So you can do it in universities, you can do it on your laptops. So making cheaper AI and smaller data AI and AI that points from the people back up to power, I think this is an important phase. And again, I think this isn't the kind of AI that you'll see coming out of central authoritarian regimes. It's going to come out of democracies. And I think a lot of universities are working on this. And I think this, to me, is a very important next step for us.
Hello, Dr. Ito, thank you so much. Your talk is very inspiring. As one of your slides that you pointed to, no matter Web 1, Web 2, it all end up to from decentralized to centralization. Part of that was probably because economics, probably because of just how nature that the human wants to take control. As we looked at the Web 3 development, no matter it's DAO, AI, especially with OpenAI going to only this far, you know, in the very, very beginning, but there are already so much to talk about how it could be go out of hand, how it could be manipulated. So I just want to get your thoughts about how is that going to play out, given that the authorities are so far behind, but at the same time, the tendency is to take greater control out of a new technology, but the technology is developing so rapidly. So how do we look at the Web3 in the next 3 to 5 years? Is it going to be constant intervention, or you could actually go into really much more of a self-governed, technology-driven kind of DAO model? Thank you.
Yeah. So there's my hope, and what's actually going to happen is different. I have a Chinese friend who told me this proverb, which said, "Money is lonely. It likes to go where other money is." You know, and I think there's this kind of physics of power, where money and power like to go where other power is. So every wave of decentralization is usually the younger generation, like the Web3 kids, pushing against authority, pushing against power, and using technology to break it up. And kind of the hippies did this too. But once they get older and the money starts to flow, they're like, oh, let's go where the power is. And even with Web3, you have like Bored Apes now, and you have the big crypto whales, because they think, oh, my parents were different, they were bad. I'll be fine if I have money. But then money corrupts, and all the money starts to behave like the generations for thousands of years. And so I think that the key thing is you kind of have to, this gets to technology, you kind of have to build in some of this stuff. So there's another, my friend Cory Doctorow often says, it's like, even if you know you don't want to eat those cookies at midnight, when you're drunk and it's midnight and you open the cupboard, you eat the cookies. So the way that you stop it is you have to throw the cookies in the toilet in the afternoon, not before you are going to eat them. And so it's kind of like with crypto, we have to, as much as possible, make it impossible to be corrupt once the power becomes corrupting. And so a lot of this discussion we were having yesterday about sort of like with let's take FTX, right? So again, imagine you're a CEO and you have billions of dollars and you have this moment where it might collapse and you could do this unethical thing, take your customer money and invest it. And if you do that and you're lucky, no one will notice. If you're unlucky, everything's over. But so what? It's over anyway, and getting shot through the head 10 times doesn't make any difference, so I'm going to take that risk, right? So many CEOs will take that ethical risk at the end because there's no choice. But if you ask them when they started, if I could make it such that I could never make the wrong choice at gunpoint at the end, that's the kind of thing that we need to do in the afternoon before you want the Oreo, in the afternoon before you have to make this life-changing decision as a CEO. So we have to set up structures that are impossible to be corrupted. It's not always possible, but I think we need to think about it in that way. I think some of the kids are thinking about it that way. I think many aren't. Many are thinking about, okay, this is my chance to become wealthy, and I think this has a lot to do with the values. So I think that the younger generation does have different values, but I don't think the good thing about young people is they don't know what the history, so they make the same mistakes, but they take risks that I wouldn't take. But they also don't realize this slippery slope that happens all of the time. And so I think this has to be kind of a collaboration between our generation and the young generation to try to get them to build the ideal models legally and regulatorily so that we can try to lock in some of the values. And it's really, really difficult because the technology is also quite difficult, And so I think that that layer has to have a conversation. But I think that, again, we're starting with conferences like yesterday. We have to sit at the same table. We have to come to consensus of the future we're trying to build. And again, the early people, when they do, the early crypto people, are completely decentralized. But the answer is somewhere in between, right? And I think that having that conversation is tremendously important. I think your point is super important. I feel somewhat optimistic, but not super optimistic. And I think that we really have to fight here. And again, I think getting back to the paradigm, I think it's it's important to support entrepreneurs, but I think it's important not to too much idolize just making lots of money, and I think that's why my conversation with Audrey Tang today is super inspiring, because Audrey has this view that it's the social impact, democracy, and getting people engaged in democracy. I think Aya Miyaguchi at Ethereum Foundation, for her, it's not about the money. And I think we need to give the non-money-making members of the community as much, or if not more, attention than the people who are going to be on the front page of Bloomberg News. So I think that's the paradigm. Don't measure success just with money. We have to measure success in other ways, and I think that can maybe help shift some of this. But it's super important.
We received one more question. The gentleman over there.
Hi, 私は相棒です。Welcome to Taipei, and it's really good speech. That I just want to echo the previous two questions. So that we pretty much talk about the cognitive science, and we also talk about the paradigms. So I have actually one kind of practical problem that actually struggled me for the past 10 years. That I actually run part of my funds by the AI systems, and in some ways that I always outperform the market more than 10 times. So my more extreme fund, I can generate in 1,200 times compared to my initial investment. So I always ask myself, how is this possible? Because the system is actually ruled by me. So the whole logic is actually given by me. And somehow, I don't know, this is actually, if it's because of the cognitive science that the AI is keep evolving, so it can help me to make sense of how the general public likes. So it can actually capture something that I cannot do it myself, because if I control or if I manage my own fund, my highest return is only 72 times. Compared to how AI manage it, it's 1,200 times. So this question is actually struggled me for the past 10 years, and I keep asking me why every time the computer is giving me something that I know nothing about the underlying companies, but somehow this I know we're generating, I would say, unbelievable returns. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know if it was a question, but I will say that if you look at just the history of hedge funds and trading, the people who bring in new technologies like physics have always outperformed the markets initially because they can deploy strategies that didn't exist before. And it's not surprising that an AI strategy is useful right now. But I will say that as AI start competing with AIs, I do think that it will be interesting to see how the human difference is going to be the competitive thing, because I think that many of the things flatten eventually, right? So that, like, even with the hedge funds, eventually the alpha gets squeaked out as everybody catches up. So if you're the single person, it's easy to clean up. If you're the shark at the tuna convention, but once you get past it, I think it gets harder, and then it goes back, I think, to people. So I think it goes back and forth. And even when you look at GPT, it's like a very intelligent student, but only gives you kind of the answer that is fact-based. And that little twist at the end to do something, it can still be creative, but it doesn't turn it on its head and do the unpredictable thing. And that unpredictable thing, I think, is the piece. And so there's actually a good analogy. So in chess, you saw that computers beat chess. But now, if you see the competition, the centaur competitions, it's computers and humans working together that are better than computers or than humans. And so I think what's going to happen is you start to see AI and human interface getting better so that you understand what's going on and the AI understands you, and it becomes a collaborative system. And I think that will be where the next phase will be.
Oh, and that actually answered my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joy, for such a wonderful talk today. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask ChatGPT, who is more important, my father or my mother? Okay. Although the topic Joy covered is called the impact of future technology on media. Actually, it covers a lot of different fields and provide us rich information and insights. Joy is to stay here only for 48 hours and is going back to Japan this afternoon. I hope that in the future we can invite Joy come to Taiwan more often. And it's more important that this time I know Joy now knows a lot of people with a lot of money, right? Okay, so you can come often to build a partnership with those investors, and also many people who are very, very interested in the technology development in the future. Thank you, Joe. And thank you for you all to come. Thank you.